In the quiet countryside of Normandy, France, there was a strange kind of danger. It did not always announce itself with artillery. Sometimes there was no movement at all. No footsteps, no voice. Only a wall of earth, tangled roots and leaves stretching across a field. These ancient Norman hedgerows had divided farmland for generations, but in the summer of 1944, they became something else entirely. They became defensive positions, hiding places, observation posts, and for many American soldiers, places from which an unseen rifle could suddenly speak. An American infantryman could walk across an open field and never see the man watching him. A rifle could fire once, and then silence would return. For the soldiers moving through this country, one of the most dangerous questions was often the simplest. Where is the sniper? There were ways to search, there were ways to return fire, and sometimes there was a much simpler idea. A steel American helmet, a piece of wood, and a little patience. The idea was deceptively simple. Make the enemy believe a soldier had exposed his head above the hedgerow, then wait and listen, because somewhere beyond the leaves, someone might be waiting to take the shot. And if that shot came, the hidden rifleman might reveal the one thing he had spent so much effort concealing, his position. And if you enjoy quiet journeys through history like this, you're welcome to subscribe. Now, let us return to Normandy in the summer of 1944. The countryside of western France did not look like the battlefields many American soldiers had imagined. There were no endless deserts, no enormous plains, no distant horizons where opposing armies could easily be seen. Instead, there were fields, small fields, orchards, narrow roads, sunken lanes, and everywhere the thick walls of the Norman Bocage. For centuries, farmers had created boundaries between their fields using banks of earth, stones, trees, and dense vegetation. Over generations, those boundaries grew. Some of the hedgerows were several feet high and several feet thick. Others were even larger, forming walls that could hide men and weapons almost completely. U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. To a farmer, they were simply part of the landscape. To a soldier arriving in Normandy, they could become something much more serious. A field might appear empty, but beyond the hedge there could be another field, and beyond that field another hedge. Each one could conceal another defensive position. The German army quickly understood the advantage. The hedgerows provided cover. They broke the countryside into small compartments. They restricted visibility. They made movement difficult, and they gave defenders natural positions from which to watch the approaches. U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. For the Americans, this meant that even after leaving the beaches behind, the fighting did not become easier. In some ways, it became more intimate. The enemy might be only 50 yards away, sometimes closer, yet the two sides could remain almost completely invisible to one another. The official U.S. Army history of the fighting around Saint-Lô described this strange character of the battlefield. American and German troops could be separated by only a short distance while still being unable to see one another through the dense countryside. U.S. Army Center of Military History. And in that environment, the sniper became especially dangerous. On June 6, 1944, American forces came ashore in Normandy as part of Operation Overlord. More than 5,000 ships and thousands of landing craft were involved in the invasion, while airborne troops had already been dropped behind the beaches. U.S. Army Center of Military History. At Omaha Beach, the fighting was particularly severe. Men crossed the beach under fire. Units struggled to move inland, and eventually the surviving troops began pushing into the countryside beyond the shoreline. That was when the landscape itself became part of the battle. The beach was behind them, but Normandy had not opened up. Instead, the Americans entered the Bocage. The fields were enclosed, the roads were narrow, the hedges blocked visibility, and German defenders could disappear into the landscape. For an American soldier, this created an unsettling experience. You could be walking through an orchard in broad daylight and suddenly hear a rifle crack, then nothing. You might look toward the hedge. There would be leaves, branches, shadow, perhaps a patch of disturbed earth, but no obvious enemy. The German sniper had no reason to remain visible. His strength was concealment, and the Americans had to find him. A sniper's greatest advantage is not simply marksmanship, it is uncertainty. The soldier being watched does not know exactly where the shot will come from. In the Normandy hedgerows, that uncertainty was magnified by the terrain. A German rifleman could use the earth bank of a hedge for protection. Branches could break up his outline, leaves could hide movement, and the surrounding fields created long, narrow areas where an advancing American soldier might become visible for only a moment. The Americans responded in different ways. Sometimes infantrymen returned fire. Sometimes rifle grenades were used. Sometimes artillery or mortars could be brought against suspected positions. And sometimes soldiers simply had to wait. A wartime U.S. Army photograph from July 6, 1944, for example, shows American infantrymen taking cover after being fired upon by a German sniper while preparing to engage the position with a rifle grenade. The photograph captures something important about the hedgerow war. The enemy did not necessarily need to appear. A single shot could be enough to stop an entire group of men. Everyone would freeze. Eyes would search the vegetation. Rifles would point toward the hedge. And somewhere behind that wall of earth and greenery, the sniper could simply wait. This was a contest of patience. The American soldiers needed information. The sniper needed concealment. And eventually, someone would have to make the first mistake. Imagine standing behind a Norman hedgerow. You cannot see through it. You cannot simply walk forward. The other side might contain a machine gun, a rifleman, a sniper, or nothing at all. The uncertainty itself becomes exhausting. The American soldier has to decide whether to expose himself, but exposing yourself is precisely what the enemy wants. That created a peculiar tactical problem. How do you make the enemy reveal himself without revealing yourself first? The answer could involve observation. A soldier might use a periscope to look over or around an obstacle while keeping most of his body concealed. Other soldiers watched suspected positions, and in the close country of Normandy, observation could be just as important as shooting. The U.S. Army's historical accounts repeatedly emphasize how concealment shaped the fighting. German defenders could use the hedgerows as ready-made defensive positions, while Americans gradually adapted their tactics to the terrain. Army University Press. The battlefield became a place where small details mattered. A movement in the leaves, a disturbed branch, a flash,
a sound, or perhaps the brief appearance of a helmet. The idea behind the helmet trick was simple. A soldier could attach or raise an American M1 helmet on a stick or similar object and carefully lift it above the cover. From a distance and under the right conditions, it could resemble the top of a soldier's head appearing over the hedgerow. To the hidden sniper, that could look like an opportunity. The important part was not the helmet itself, it was the reaction it might produce. A sniper waiting patiently for a target could see the helmet rise. Perhaps the instinct was immediate. Perhaps the rifle had already been aimed toward that point. The sniper squeezes the trigger. A shot breaks the silence, and the helmet drops. But the American soldiers have not been standing there exposed. They have been watching, waiting, listening. And if the shot produces a visible muzzle flash, movement, or other identifiable clue, the sniper has given away something far more valuable than the Americans could have obtained by simply staring at the hedge. He has given them a location. The trap works because the sniper believes he is the hunter. But for a brief moment, the hunter has become the source of information. And that is the quiet genius of the tactic. The Americans did not necessarily need to see the sniper. They needed the sniper to reveal himself.
There's something strangely quiet after the moment a rifle is fired. The sound travels, then fades. The smoke disappears. The battlefield becomes still again. But the soldiers watching have changed. They now know that somewhere in that landscape there is a rifleman. Perhaps behind the hedge, perhaps inside a concealed position, perhaps farther away than expected. The important thing is that the uncertainty has narrowed, and once a position was identified, other weapons could be brought into the fight. Mortars were especially valuable because infantrymen did not always need a direct line of sight to engage a target. The broader Normandy campaign relied heavily on the cooperation of infantry, artillery, armor, engineers, and other supporting arms. As American forces learned the peculiar problems of the Bocage, they increasingly adapted their methods to the terrain. Army University Press. The sniper had tried to remain invisible. The helmet had given him a reason to shoot, and the shot had potentially transformed an invisible enemy into a target. There was no dramatic duel, no charging across an open field, just a helmet rising above a hedge, a rifle cracking, and men on the other side suddenly knowing where to look. The deeper the Americans moved into Normandy, the more obvious the problem became. The hedgerows were not merely obstacles, they changed the geometry of the battlefield. A field could be entered only through certain openings. A road could be dominated from one side. A hedge could conceal defenders while restricting the movement of attackers. The German defenders had learned to exploit these characteristics. The Americans had to learn them too. In the early stages, the hedgerows could make even small advances expensive. The U.S. Army later described the countryside as a place where German defenders could use the natural barriers to create overlapping fields of fire and concealment. U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. This was why a simple object like a helmet could become useful. It was part of a larger contest. The Americans were learning to separate what the enemy could see from what the enemy thought he could see. That distinction mattered. A sniper did not have to be physically exposed to believe he had a target. He only had to believe the target was exposed, and that was enough. The helmet trick also reveals something about infantry combat that is easy to overlook. Sometimes the most important action is doing nothing. The American soldiers had to wait. The sniper had to wait. Both sides understood that movement could be fatal. The difference was that one side was trying to create a reaction. The other side was trying to avoid giving one away. This made the hedgerows psychologically exhausting. A soldier could spend minutes staring at the same patch of leaves. Nothing happened. Another minute. Still nothing. Then a sound, a movement, a shot, and suddenly everyone was alert. The U.S. Army's contemporary histories describe the Normandy hedgerow fighting as a brutal contest in which small groups and individual snipers could hold up larger forces because of the extraordinary concealment offered by the terrain. U.S. Army Center of Military History. The landscape rewarded patience, and patience could become a weapon. But the Americans were not fighting only individual riflemen. The German defensive positions could include machine guns, mortars, anti-tank weapons, and infantry using the hedgerows as cover. U.S. Army Center of Military History. That meant the solution could never be a single trick. The Americans had to adapt on a much larger scale. Infantry learned how to approach the hedges. Tanks were brought forward. Engineers worked to create passages. Artillery provided support, and eventually, American units developed specialized methods for breaking through the Bocage. One of the most famous solutions came from Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, Jr., whose hedgerow cutter transformed tanks into machines capable of punching through the earthen walls instead of climbing over them. U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. These modified tanks became known as rhinos. The idea was simple but important. Instead of fighting the terrain exactly as the Germans expected, the Americans changed the terrain itself. The helmet trick was small, the Cullen cutter was large, but both reflected the same principle. Adapt, observe, find the weakness, and use it. By July, the struggle through the hedgerows had become a grinding campaign. One of the major objectives was Saint-Lô. The town was strategically important because of its position in the road network of Normandy. But reaching it meant crossing the Bocage. The fighting was exhausting. The field seemed endless. One hedge gave way to another, then another. American troops advanced through a terrain that seemed almost designed to slow them down. The official U.S. Army account of the fighting describes the experience in stark terms. Infantrymen moved through mud and hedgerows while facing bullets, artillery, tanks, and hidden enemy positions. U.S. Army Center of Military History. The battle was not glamorous. It was close, slow, and physically exhausting. A few yards could matter. A single field could consume hours, and a hidden sniper could force an entire unit to stop. This was the environment in which little tactical tricks became valuable. A helmet might save a soldier from exposing his head. A periscope might provide a safer view. A mortar might reach a position that rifles could not reach. A tank might tear through a hedge that infantry could not cross safely. Piece by piece, the Americans learned how to fight the country they had entered. The American advance through Normandy was not won by one weapon. It was won through adaptation. The Germans had the advantage of prepared positions and familiar defensive terrain. The Americans had enormous resources, but resources alone did not make a hedgerow easier to cross. They needed experience, they needed coordination, and they needed solutions. By late July, these adaptations were becoming increasingly important. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, sought to break through the German defenses west of Saint-Lô and open the way into the wider French countryside. Army. The breakthrough changed the character of the campaign. For weeks, the Americans had been fighting for fields. Now the possibility of open country was approaching.
The Bocage had not defeated them, but it had forced them to change.
Years later, it is easy to remember the helmet trick as a clever battlefield story. A soldier puts a helmet on a stick, a sniper shoots, the Americans locate him. Simple. But the real lesson is deeper. The trick worked only within a larger system of observation and fire support. The helmet created a possible target. The sniper created a clue. Observers watched, other soldiers interpreted what they saw, and supporting weapons could respond. It was not the helmet alone, it was the process. Deception to observation, to identification, to response. And this was happening in a battlefield where the enemy could be almost impossible to see. The German sniper depended on concealment. The American soldier depended on patience. The hedge concealed one side. The helmet created the illusion of exposure. And for one brief moment, the hidden rifleman could be persuaded to reveal himself. For the men living through it, none of this was a clever history lesson. It was simply another day in Normandy. A soldier could wake in the morning without knowing whether he would move 10 yards or 1,000. He could look at the same hedge for hours. He could hear distant artillery, then silence, then a rifle. And somewhere nearby, another young man was doing exactly the same thing from the opposite side. The official histories describe the fighting as costly and exhausting. Units suffered heavy losses. Fresh replacements arrived while the battle was still underway. Friendships built during training could be broken in a matter of days. U.S. Army Center of Military History. That is one of the quiet realities of the Normandy campaign. The great movements on maps were made from thousands of small moments. A man crossing a field, a tank approaching a hedge, an engineer preparing an opening, a rifleman watching a gap, a helmet rising above the vegetation, a shot, then silence. History is often remembered through names of battles, but battles are lived through moments. Eventually, the Americans broke beyond the worst of the Bocage. The campaign began to move. The capture of Saint-Lô helped open the way for the breakout. Then came Operation Cobra. American armored formations began moving through the gaps. The landscape that had trapped the infantry for weeks was finally behind them. The German position in Normandy began to unravel, and the war moved toward the open roads of France. The hedgerows remained as silent witnesses. Trees, earth, fields, old farm boundaries. They had existed long before the armies arrived, and they would remain long after the soldiers were gone. There is a tendency to imagine military history as a contest between weapons, one rifle against another, one tank against another, one army against another. But Normandy offers a different lesson. Sometimes the decisive advantage comes from understanding the environment. The Americans entered a landscape they did not fully understand. The Germans knew how to use it, so the Americans learned. They adapted their tactics. They developed new equipment. They combined infantry with armor and artillery. They learned to observe before exposing themselves. And sometimes, when an enemy sniper was hidden behind a hedgerow, they used something almost absurdly ordinary, a steel helmet. Not because the helmet was powerful, not because it could stop the battle, but because it could create a question in the mind of the man holding the rifle. Is that a soldier? And if the answer seemed to be yes, the rifle might fire. And that single shot could tell the Americans what they needed to know. Tonight, When we picture Normandy in 1944, we often imagine the great events, the landing craft approaching the beaches, the aircraft crossing the English Channel, the tanks moving inland, the flags, the maps, the advancing armies. But much of the war was quieter than that. It happened behind hedgerows, along narrow roads, in small fields where men could be only a short distance apart and still remain invisible to one another. A German sniper waited behind a wall of earth and vegetation. An American soldier waited on the other side. Between them was the landscape of Normandy. And sometimes, rising slowly above that landscape, there was only a helmet. For a moment, the helmet looked like a man. The rifle fired. The silence returned. But the silence was different now, because somewhere beyond the hedge, the Americans knew a little more than they had known before. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the Normandy hedgerows. War is not always decided by the loudest weapon. Sometimes it is decided by the person who notices something first, a movement, a sound, a flash, or a helmet where a head should have been. The hedgerows of France are peaceful now. The fields are green again. The roads are quiet, and the men who once watched those walls have long since grown old or passed into history. But for a few weeks in the summer of 1944, those ordinary hedges became some of the most difficult ground American soldiers had ever crossed. And somewhere in that landscape, a simple American helmet could become something more than a piece of equipment. It could become a question, a decoy, a moment of patience, and sometimes the first clue that an invisible enemy was no longer invisible. If you'd like to return for another quiet journey through history, you're always welcome here. Good night.